Yes, yeah. And another. Yeah, very good.
Okay, and now I change the language and very warmly welcome Hans Jakobsson to tell his book and story about the Boeing 747. And I told in Finnish for the guys that you might sing up some books after the presentation, and we have still a few left on the table, so if anyone is interested after the presentation, then we can tell you some of these things. And we were listening to Hans' presentation, and I will a little bit downphrase Viking, so maybe the presentation shows better. And everybody on the line, I hope my voice hearing also welcome to this evening, and Hans, you welcome, very welcome.
Please. Thank you very much. Okay, everybody, welcome to my lecture on the Boeing 747 in SAS. I'm very honored to be here, to meet all of you, and welcome to everyone on the internet as well. My name is Hans Jakobsson. I'm a Swedish airline historian and an aeronautical engineer. And for the last 3 years, I've written a book about the 747 in SAS history, in SAS service. It's in Swedish. It's called 747B, the Stora Vikingen, and literally translates in English to the huge Viking. And as some of you may know, the first 747 with SAS was named Huge Viking, or in English, Huge Viking, which is a pun. I will come back to why that name was chosen later on. We're all familiar with the 747. In 2021, it was 50 years since it entered service. And I think you've all seen the photo on the upper right. That's the prototype on its rollout in Seattle in 1968, with stewardesses from all 27 customer airlines. And the stewardess number 6 from the left is the Swedish SAS chief stewardess Vivica Ankarkrona. The image on the lower right is the last 747 being actually built right now in Boeing's factories in Seattle. That's aircraft number 1574. It's being assembled as I speak right now, and will be delivered to Atlas Air, an American cargo airline, in about January, February next year. It's currently being built, and that's the last 747 to be produced. And that's an amazing feat, because originally it was believed that Boeing would have to produce about only 50 747s, because in the 1960s, it was believed that in the 70s and 80s, everyone would travel supersonically. They were constructing the Concorde. Boeing had their own project called the 2707 SST, supersonic transport, and the Russians obviously had their Tupolev 144 as well. So everyone believed in those days that travel would be supersonic. You should be able to jet off to New York in 3 hours from Europe, and to Tokyo in 7 or 8 hours. But in the meantime, until there were enough 747s out, you would have enough Concordes out and SSTs out, you would have something in between to take care of the growing air traffic in the 1960s. And Pan American, the legendary American airline formed in 1927, was the launch customer for the 707, as you can see in the smaller aircraft of the two. That was the first real proper airliner for the jet age, that the 707 and the DC-8. And in the 1960s, air travel expanded so rapidly, so the 707 and the DC-8s became too small very quickly. And the charismatic director of Pan American Airways, one trip, he envisioned that we would need a much larger aircraft to be able to cope with the increasing passenger numbers. Pan American Airlines was the leading airline and was leading the technical advancements of aviation, civil aviation in those days. They launched the Boeing 314, the Clipper flying boats, the 377 Strato cruiser, which was the first large aircraft, if you will. It was a 4-engine piston aircraft with double-decker, and the 707, as I just said. His vision was that aviation and flying should be for everyone, not just the rich and famous. And that's why he was a very busy proponent in lowering airfares. He wanted tickets to be as cheap as possible. But as you probably know, there was a cartel called International Air Travel Association. They are still operating today, but in those days when air travel was regulated, airlines, SAS, Finnair, Lufthansa, and everyone met once a year in large conferences and made up the next year's timetables, airfares, aircraft types, and so on. And no airline was allowed to deviate from these rules. So it was very expensive because obviously they wanted to keep their incomes. Juan Trip and Pan Am didn't want to be part of this. They wanted airfares to be lower, and the association worked against it. But nevertheless, in 1952, after some struggles, he made the cartel lower the prices, and it actually introduced tourist class in aviation, because until then there had only been first class, which was incredibly expensive. And in 1952, SAS, Pan American, BOAC, and all the other major airlines introduced tourist class for the very first time. The prices were still very expensive, but slightly lower than first class, at least. It became very popular. Air travel increased very much already in the 1950s, and in the 60s there were some further price reductions, and by the mid-1960s air travel had expanded so much that it was really necessary to make larger aircraft. Now you had the DC-8, obviously you're familiar with the DC-8s here in Finland as well. Douglas aircraft could stretch the DC-8 by 11 meters to create the DC-8-61 for the American domestic services. It had seats for up to 259 passengers. And then from that, they developed the DC-8-62, which SAS purchased, and also Finnair. I will come back to that later on. And by combining 62 and 61 versions, you got the DC-8-63, which was the first jumbo jet of the jet age, and it entered service in 1967. Boeing wasn't able to stretch the 707 in the same way. The construction didn't allow it, so they had to start from scratch, and that's why they came up with this huge aircraft. It was actually, before it got the designation 747, they called it New Large Aircraft. And it was 2.5 times bigger than the 707. It had space for up to 490 passengers, 100 tons of cargo, and it was a double-decker. And why was it a double-decker then? Well, earlier in the 1960s, the American Department of Defense had launched a competition for the American aviation industry. They wanted a new cargo aircraft to be able to transport troops and vehicles from the US to Europe in the event of a war. And for that, they needed a much larger cargo capacity. The aircraft in those days weren't able to transport the material needed to reinforce European troops. Boeing entered the competition with a concept called CX-HLS. Lockheed entered the competition with a concept which was a double-decker. Boeing was also a double-decker, and Lockheed won. And that was the aircraft which then became the C-5 Galaxy. Boeing had learned something from this development. They had learned that they could actually construct large aircraft. And with this knowledge, a construction engineer named Joe Sutter started drawing a passenger aircraft of the same concept, and that became the 747. Which was then presented to the world in 1968 and flew for the first time in 1969. And now they're actually then building the very last 747, and they built much more than 50 aircraft as they first planned. Who am I then? Well, I'm from the Swedish west coast, north of Gothenburg. I was born in 1975, and when I was 10 years old, I flew with my parents from the Canary Islands to Gothenburg on a DC-8 on the Swedish Scandinavian charter airline Scanair. And the pilots, I was invited to the cockpit, and the pilots asked if I wanted to see their Christmas tree. And of course, I said yes. I didn't know what they were meaning. And they flipped a switch, and every light in the cockpit went on. And I was flabbergasted. And since then, I'm an aviation enthusiast. And that was 32 years ago. I became an aeronautical engineer and have been working as a flight simulator engineer with SAS Flight Academy at Stockholm Arlanda Airport for 12 years. I left that work 10 years ago, but I was mainly working with the MD-80 simulator and also with our helicopter simulator, and we had, among other customers, the Finnish Armed Forces training in our helicopter simulator, which was very nice. And this is me outside one of our MD-80 simulators in Copenhagen, actually. I was also involved in making the 747, the Jumbo Hostel at Arlanda Airport, the world's first hotel in a former 747. And this aircraft was originally delivered to Singapore Airlines and then went on to Pan American and a few other airlines until it was taken out of service in Stockholm in 2003. I have designed some parts of the interior and some parts of the information material. I'm also a model builder. I mainly build civil aircraft and especially SAS model aircraft. This is an MD-87 in 1/144th scale, which I'm very proud of. And already in the 1990s, I started writing aviation history on the internet. So I launched the first Boeing 747 website already in 1996, and I've been writing about airline history and military history since then on the internet. And in 2019, I got the idea that it would soon be 50 years since SAS received their first 747. That would be in 2021. A former SAS employee and I'm very involved in SAS history. I knew that airline, that they would not mark that anniversary themselves. And there has been very little information written about the history of SAS 747s over the years. There's many myths and legends about it, but nothing concrete, so to speak. So I decided I have to write that history myself. I had to research and write that history myself. And I started that work in late 2019. This is me sitting in a hotel room at Stockholm Bromma Airport, but it's not any hotel room. It's actually a hotel which is in the former SAS headquarters. And that is the hotel suite, which is the former managing director of the president's office. So I'm sitting at the exact spot where all the SAS presidents from Carl Florman until Jan Carlson in the 1980s. And in that room, they have discussed the 747 projects and every other major aircraft project in SAS. So it was quite an experience to be sitting there and writing my book about the 747s 50 years later. Then, of course, the pandemic struck. I was unable to travel to Denmark, to Norway, to interview all the veterans. So it was quite hard for a bit, but eventually the borders opened, the archives opened, and the people were able to meet me again. So it eventually became a book of 320 pages, which was presented in Stockholm in September this year. And now 2 months have passed, and more than half of the print run has already been sold. It's a great success. And I'm very impressed because the subject is quite narrow, so that so many people have bought my book and find it so interesting. It's amazing, because after all, the SAS Boeing 747 is not the subject that you see on television or hear about in radios. So that's a little bit about me. SAS operated the 747 from 1971 until 1987. They had 6 aircraft. And that was one of the major issues why I wanted to write a book about it, because if you listen to the official airline history and many other people, they say that the 747 operation in Scandinavia was a failure. It was uneconomical, it was too large, and so on. And it was too large, that's why SAS eventually disposed of them. But if it was an economical failure, if it was such a mishap to operate the 747, why did SAS purchase 4 more of them? I eventually found out. We had 6 aircraft, 3 passenger versions and 3 combi versions. It was purchased mainly for the Copenhagen to New York service in 1971 and continued to operate that very same route for 16 years until the very last flight in 1987. Over the years, the 747 also flew to Chicago, Seattle, Los Angeles, Montreal, and also to Tokyo via Anchorage in 1974. And also in the 1980s, it operated to Bangkok and Singapore when traffic was very high in that area. And obviously on the upper right, that is the tail markings of the charter airline Scanair, because in the weekends, all the time in the weekends, the aircraft was operated on charter services, mainly to the Canary Islands, but also to the Greek and Spanish islands in the Mediterranean, just like Finnair used to do with their large aircraft. In 1987, that was the official end of 747 operations in SAS, but 13 years later it came back. Oh, sorry, not 13 years later, 7 years later. In 1996, the 747 made a comeback in SAS, but as a cargo aircraft. SAS Cargo leased an aircraft from Atlas Air, the American cargo giant, to operate cargo services based in Gothenburg to New York and to Japan and Macau, and for 3 years. And the conclusion, after having interviewed so many people, from pilots, cabin crew, technicians, passengers, travel agents, and so on, not a single one of them can say anything negative about the 747. Regardless of its service in SAS or any other airline, everyone loves the 747, and now it's being phased out from the world's airlines. There are very few airlines actually operating the 747 in passenger service right now. Lufthansa is the only one in Europe still flying the 747. And you have Korean Air in South Korea and a few other, but otherwise it's now earning its keep as a cargo aircraft all over the world. But it's the perfect aircraft. Scandinavian airline system was formed in 1946, but already in 1936 there were discussions about establishing a Nordic cooperation for airline service to New York. Mr. Charles Lindbergh of aviation fame was working for Pan American Airways in those days. And he actually approached the Danish airline DDL and the Swedish airline AB Eurotransport for a cooperation project with Pan American and DDL and ABA. And also later on with DNL, the Norwegian airline. The idea back then was to operate, Norwegian airline would operate from Norway to Iceland. DDL and ABA would operate connecting flights from Scandinavia to West Norway. And then the Norwegian airline would fly to Reykjavik in Iceland, where they would connect with Pan American flights coming from New York. And back then it was also planned that Aero, the Finnish airline, would actually be a part of this cooperation. Pan American left this agreement, and the Nordic airlines continued to discuss this project together. And then after a while, Pan American regained their interest, but they said, we want to negotiate with one airline, not 4 airlines. You have to create a consortium. And that was the beginning of what became SAS. You have, and that was in 1939. Of course, then Aero was unable to be part of that consortium because you were in war that time. And by April of 1940, the Norwegian, the Swedish, and Danish airlines were ready to sign an agreement, and this was on 6th of April 1940. And 3 days later, Norway and Denmark was also in war. So it became nothing of Scandinavian United Airlines, as the name was actually planned to be back then. But during the war, the Swedish airline continued to work as much as possible to establish this airline. They ordered aircraft in the USA. And when the war was over, the negotiations continued, but Aero was unable to participate because you had a new reality after the war. So it was a Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish airline. And after heavy negotiations, SAS was formed in August of 1946, and in September of 1946, the first flight departed Stockholm to New York via Oslo and Prestwick in Scotland and Gander with the DC-4. Up to the left, there is the Boeing 377 Stratocruiser. That was the largest propliner of this age, and the Swedish airline actually ordered 4 of these aircraft for use by SAS, but Boeing wasn't able to deliver them in time, and eventually SAS cancelled that order and went for the DC-6 and DC-6B instead. So this is a doctored photo, but those 4 aircraft were actually taken over by BOAC, the British airline, and they carried their full Scandinavian interior, because the interior, one aircraft had a Swedish interior, one had a Danish, and one had a Norwegian interior with motifs from nature and cities in those countries. And the 4th aircraft had a all Scandinavian interior, and BOAC took over those interiors. So those aircraft flew actually with Scandinavian cabin interiors for their entire life in BOAC in the 50s. In the 1940s and early 50s, SAS and Pan American were almost operating alone over the North Atlantic, which meant that SAS had very much traffic. And they operated via Scotland, they operated via Germany as well. And in 1952, as I said, they introduced a tourist class named Globetrotter in SAS. This was a great success. And it went so well that even already in 1957, more people were flying over the North Atlantic than going by boat. And since then, aviation has been more popular than boats over the Atlantic to America. In 1958, a 3rd class, economy class, was introduced, 20% lower prices. So you actually had 3 classes in every flight back then. And also you had the new DC-7C, Super C's the large piston airliner, which was forced by competition. The DC-7 and the 747 had some parallel history, because Pan American wanted the best, most modern aircraft, and they made Douglas construct the DC-7C, and every other airline had to order the DC-7C in order to compete with Pan American. SAS was one of them. 1960, the 707 and the DC-8 came, and everyone learned a new word, jet crisis, because jet aircraft were much more efficient than propeller aircraft. They produced many more seats, and overnight there were too much capacity available. Airlines went bankrupt. There were enormous amounts of very good, very modern aircraft on the second-hand market suddenly, which no one wanted because they were propeller aircraft. Everyone wanted jet aircraft. But some airlines took advantage of this, like the Icelandic low-cost airline Loftleiðir. They operated modern propliners on low-cost services between USA and Europe with a short transfer in Reykjavik. And they were very busy flying to Scandinavia and Finland. They operated to many places in the Nordic countries, competing with SAS, and which was a very big problem for SAS in those days, because they weren't operating on an equal basis. And this is a familiar wording, because that's the same argument that SAS has used talking about Ryanair in modern times and all the other low-cost airlines. Loft gliding eventually became a large problem, mostly for SAS, but also for the other European mainline carriers, because they had lower prices, they had slower aircraft, and they attracted students and people with less money than those able to afford jet aircraft flying. Well, in 1964 there was a price reduction, which then meant that larger aircraft were needed. And as I said, the DC-8-62, which SAS and Finnair purchased, was a result of this. And the DC-8-62 was actually constructed, the basic construction was actually made up in a hotel room in Stockholm between engineers from Douglas Aircraft and SAS. It was followed by the DC-8-63, which was delivered to SAS in 1968. It had 194 seats, and it was the jumbo jet of its age. SAS initially ordered 6 of these aircraft, mainly for the New York route, but it was soon operated on most long distance routes all over the world. It was the perfect aircraft for SAS. It had the best economy, it was very efficient, and it had the best combination of cost and profit of any aircraft in SAS fleet so far. And SAS also introduced movie and music entertainment on board. This was a result of the increased competition from the new aircraft ordered by the competitors, such as Pan Am, because when this aircraft was delivered in 1968, the 747 was already on the horizon. The first were to be delivered in 1969, as it was planned back then. So if SAS could offer film and music on board, hopefully they could attract some more passengers. It was a vision back then that the DC-8-63 would be SAS' main aircraft until at least 1975. SAS understood that they had to buy the 747 or any other larger aircraft, such as the DC-10, which was also being constructed back then, but not until 1975. And SAS and all other airlines were not expecting the 747 to be in service until at least 1970-71. But already in 1966, Pan American shocked the entire airline world when they ordered 25 747. That was a year ahead of everyone's estimations, and that created some problems for the not only for SAS but for all airlines. I mentioned Aero briefly. Back in those days, Aero and later Finnair had a quite close cooperation with SAS. Already in 1952, in connection with the Summer Olympics here in Helsinki, SAS introduced a New York service from Helsinki with the DC-6. In October of 1952, SAS flew Helsinki, Stockholm, Prestwick, Gander, New York with the DC-6 twice a week. And in 1959, it was changed to the DC-7, Helsinki, Stockholm, Copenhagen, New York. And over the many seasons until 1967-68, SAS actually had a New York service running from Helsinki, either via Stockholm or via Copenhagen. And that was it was a very popular service because that was the only service to the USA from Finland. Pan American was also operating to Helsinki, but in competition with SAS. But in 1967, SAS operated the DC-8-62 from Helsinki via Stockholm and Bergen in West Norway to New York. And they operated this service as SK921. It had the same route number all the way to New York from Helsinki. And that was something that the Finnish Aviation Authority had a problem with, because their argument was that these were two separate services. Helsinki to Stockholm was one flight, Stockholm to New York was another flight. And because of that, SAS should use separate route numbers. SAS followed that rule eventually and introduced another service, but introduced another flight number, but it was actually the same aircraft operating the entire route. The reason for this was that Finnair was actually planning to open their own New York service, which was launched in 1969 with the beautiful DC-862. And it flew from Helsinki via Copenhagen and Amsterdam to New York. And at the same time, SAS cancelled their cooperation agreement with Finnair. And until the late 1980s, the relations between SAS and Finnair was a bit on the cold side, so to speak. And since 1969, as far as I know, all the time Finnair has operated from Helsinki to New York. And there was one thing I discovered when I was doing research for my book. In 1977, actually, Finnair approached SAS and the Swedish Aviation Authority with a request to operate a DC-10 service from Helsinki to New York via Gothenburg, the new airport Landvetter in Gothenburg, which opened in 1977. But it was cancelled or turned down by SAS back then. But there was a plan to operate that one. SAS launched their own service from Gothenburg to New York instead. Why did SAS purchase the 747 then? Well, there was a few reasons actually. In December of 1966, SAS presented a very good yearly result for that year, and that was when the 747 order from Pan Am had been announced as well. So when the president announced the yearly result, a journalist asked if SAS would be interested in buying the 747 now when Pan American and Lufthansa and all the other airlines had ordered it already. But the president said no, the DC-863 is perfect for SAS purposes. We don't need the 747 for at least 5 or 7 years, or 10 years maybe. In January 1967, just 1 month later, it was completely different. Since 1958, SAS had a cooperation with Swissair, a technical cooperation, where they shared maintenance and simulated training for the Caravelle and the DC-8. And they shared maintenance between Copenhagen, Zurich, and Stockholm. And Swissair also had the same problem as SAS. Traffic was increasing. They needed larger aircraft. And then Swissair was operating the DC-862, or had ordered the DC-862, but not the 63. And SAS thought it would be natural for Swissair to order the DC-863 as well. And if they did, SAS would get the maintenance for the Swissair DC-863s, which would create jobs in Scandinavia. But the DC-863 was unable to take off from Zurich Airport with full load, regardless of atmospheric conditions over the North Atlantic. So Swissair couldn't operate the DC-863 from Switzerland to New York non-stop. And that's why Swissair started to look at the new 747. At the same time, Swissair had started operating the DC-9. And SAS had ordered the DC-9 to replace the Caravelles. Swissair demanded that they got the maintenance for SAS DC-9 fleet in Zurich. That would create much work in Switzerland. But if SAS left the maintenance of the DC-9 fleet to Swissair, that would mean that 400 or 500 people would lose their jobs in Scandinavia, which would create several problems, and also close down the maintenance base in Oslo, where the DC-9 fleet was based. In early 1967, Swissair then put up an ultimatum to SAS. If Swissair didn't get the DC-9 maintenance contract, they would cancel all the cooperation between SAS and Swissair. So to appease Swissair, SAS started looking at the 747, which Swissair was very happy about. And the first report on the SAS 747 was delivered after 2 weeks. They actually had a very fast way of working in SAS in 1967. SAS eventually decided to keep the DC-9 maintenance, but they left the engine maintenance to Swissair, and in connection with the 747 cooperation was enough to keep Swissair happy. But SAS had at the same time realized that if Pan American and all the other airlines would start operating the 747 already in 1970, SAS competition would be greatly reduced, greatly increased, and SAS would not be as competitive as they could be. There were several calculations made. They eventually showed that the economical result of operating 747s instead of DC-8 would be marginally better, but not very much better. But the 747 had a larger passenger appeal, and back then they thought that Pan American would start operating the 747 from Copenhagen in 1971. So SAS really had no choice. They had to start looking at the 747 more seriously, and to be able to operate the 747 efficiently, two aircraft were needed. So in March of 1967, SAS placed 2 options with Boeing for 747s, and then Swissair came back and told SAS that we want the maintenance contract for the 747 fleet as well. SAS obviously couldn't say yes to that, and with only 2 aircraft, it was very uneconomical to set up a maintenance organization as well as a training organization. So eventually, the Dutch airline KLM came into the picture because they had also started looking at the 747. In 1967, KLM was operating from Amsterdam to New York 40 flights a week with the DC-863, which was already too small, the same year as the aircraft was delivered. So KLM has started looking at the 747 as well, and eventually the 3 airlines started cooperating and bought a flight simulator together. And that simulator was delivered to Amsterdam and was placed in KLM Flight Academy in Schiphol Airport. And in tradition with KLM, it was named, and this simulator was named Nils Holgersson after the Swedish fairy tale of the young boy flying on a goose all over Sweden. And that was jointly owned by SAS, KLM, and Swissair, in circled KSS Group. And they also decided to share the maintenance. So the heavy maintenance contract for the 747 actually went to KLM. And all over the years, the 747 were maintained by KLM in Amsterdam. And the engines were overhauled by SAS in Stockholm. And Swissair had the avionics maintenance for them. They ordered 7 aircraft together. There was also some problems with the performance of the 747. The aircraft became heavier and heavier. The engines, the Pratt & Whitney JT9D engines, were not performing as promised. So many customers became hesitant to actually order the 747, to cancel. Had formalized their order in 1967 for 2 aircraft, and the next autumn in 1968, all the 3 airlines were hesitating and discussing whether to cancel their orders or have Boeing pay some penalties for them. But Boeing actually improved the construction in several steps, and those improvements resulted in a new aircraft called the 747B, or later on the 747-200B. And that's why my book is called 747B, because that was the SAS designation. And in the marketing, SAS said B for better. But in reality, it was designed 747-2H3B in SAS version. The 2 aircraft were to be delivered in the spring and autumn of 1971, which they also were. And later on, the French airline UTA also joined the 3 airlines, as they ordered the DC-10 together. And this is an artist's envision of aircraft engineers from the 4, from Scandinavia, from France, from Switzerland, and the Netherlands. KSSU group ordered, I think, 40 DC-10s together. How would you plan for such a large aircraft? This was the largest aircraft anyone has ever operated. Well, SAS had several project groups running, and one thing they came up with was to divide the aircraft. SAS would operate the 747 with 353 seats, and they divided the aircraft to 4 separate cabins. So they said we had 4 aircraft in one, and 107 seats in each economy class section. That was approximately the same amount as a DC-9. And you had a purser, you had 2 air hostesses in every cabin. And in first class, you had 5 cabin crew with 32 seats, and of course, then the upper deck lounge. But because of this way of working, it became a very efficient aircraft. They were in reality 3 separate cabins operating independently. The first aircraft, Hughe Viking, was delivered to SAS in February of 1971 in Seattle, or Everett, more to be precise. It was christened by Mrs. Goody Redpath with a horn, as it's called in Swedish. I can't find the English word for it right now. And she christened the aircraft by pouring vodka from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, actually. So it's purely Nordic christening procedure. And why was the aircraft called Hughe, or huge, then? Well, in the Old Norse mythology, the Snorre Sturlason Viking sagas, there was a small boy called Hughe who was a servant to Utgårda-Loke. I don't know if those names are familiar to you in Finnish. I hope so. And the gods Thor and Loke came to Utgård, where their servants Skjalve and Hughe would compete in a running competition. And Skjalve went away, and Hughe was still standing on the start line. And as Skjalve approached the finishing line, Hughe swooshed by. And it was later then revealed that Hughe was actually the mind of Utgårda-Loke, and nothing could be faster than a thought. And in Swedish, Hughe is actually the same, has the same meaning as håg, as the Swedish word komma ihåg, or hågkomst. So Hughe in Swedish or Scandinavian, Hughe has a historical meaning, but also you would obviously have the name huge in English because it symbolized the aircraft's enormous size as well. And as Hughe was also very fast, it was also very appropriate to name the aircraft Hughe or huge, because the 747 was the fastest subsonic aircraft of its age. And I think actually it still is, despite the Convair 990, which was very fast as well. The second aircraft was delivered in November of 1971. It was named Ivar Viking after Ivar Vidfamne, Wide Fathom, who was king of Denmark in the mythology. 10 minutes after the aircraft was transferred to SAS and several $1 million transferred to Boeing's account, this aircraft took off for Moses Lake, 1 hour's flight away from Seattle, where the 31st SAS pilots were starting their flight training. And those 30 pilots then eventually became instructors for the remaining colleagues at home. And then they flew for 2 weeks. They had flight training in Moses Lake every day. It went without a single mishap, or except one mishap. On one landing, one tire exploded, and that was actually the only mishap. And I was in Oslo 1 month ago holding the same lecture then, and I had an older gentleman in an audience who said, I can confirm that this happened because I was on that very flight. And that was quite amazing considering it's 51 years ago. The first aircraft arrived in Copenhagen in March of 1971, and on April 1st, it entered service as SK911 from Copenhagen to New York. And regularity was very good. Passengers were very satisfied. Service was incredible, as you can see. This is first class and the upper deck lounge as well. And SAS service back in those days was well known. all over the world, and the 747 was possibly the last of the great SAS aircraft and the last aircraft showing this Scandinavian way of service, which SAS was famous for already in the propeller days. But as I said, 10 years earlier, there had been a jet crisis, and now we had the jumbo jet crisis, because obviously all the major airlines ordered the 747, and then you had even larger extra capacity. And all the DC-8s, the 707s and so on that came out on the second-hand market now also had to compete with still the older DC-6s and DC-7s from the last crisis. So you had an enormous amount of surplus aircraft on the market. And ticket prices decreased even more, and the costs were increasing. So profit margins were becoming smaller and smaller, and SAS did not earn any money at all, almost. They had to diversify their business. They started by purchasing travel agencies. They started hotels, catering services, or expanding these services. And SAS were transformed in the 1970s from just a pure airline into a travel conglomerate, if you want, which was then expanded even more in the 1980s. But this way of operating was, or actually begun in the early 1970s. So I think some of you may like this photo. SAS had a great public relations program for the 747. They participated on several air shows, and this is Helsinki Air Show on the 25th of August of 1972. And this photo I got from a friend in this. I contacted the museum to find out if there was any information about this happening, and I was given some names, and eventually I received a photo from Juha Klemetinen. I think it was taken from the terminal in those days. And up on the upper right image is from the other view. That is from the SAS staff magazine, Inside SAS. The purpose, the SAS purpose for participating was to market a new direct connection between Helsinki and Copenhagen with the New York service from Copenhagen. The 747 arrived and was on the ground for 2 hours. In those 2 hours, 5,000 people went on board this aircraft. And you can see some of them queuing up behind. The earliest had arrived already early in the morning that day to be able to see the 747, because this was the first time the Boeing 747 visited Finland. And it was on the ground. There was chaotic traffic around the airport. There was thousands of people all over the airport wanting to see this aircraft. And it was a great event, I've learned afterwards, after speaking to many people who actually were there. And the captain piloting that flight was Ferdinand Pete Buck, a Norwegian war hero, who was the chief pilot of the 747 fleet in SAS in those days. And I actually saw his logbook entry, because his logbook is at the SAS Museum in Oslo. And in his logbook entry, he's written Helsinki Air Show, and I could actually have included this on this picture, but I forgot about that. But that is some sort of local connection. And as far as I know, that is the only time an SAS 747 visited Helsinki. It never happened after that. So in the 1970s, you had the first energy crisis in 1973-74. Some airlines went bankrupt. Some other airlines decided to sell the larger aircraft. Some of the early 747 operators then sold off their aircraft because it wasn't economical enough. SAS actually had a very good economic sense in those days and was able to keep their 2 747s. One reason was that they operated charter services, as I said, in the weekends. But there was some discussions whether to sell off the 747s and concentrate on the DC-10 fleet. The first DC-10s to SAS were delivered in 1974. And there was some differentiating interests in the management of SAS, because from the Danish board members wanted the 747 more than the DC-10, because if you had the 747, that meant you can base it in Copenhagen and you would have connecting passengers from all over Scandinavia coming to Copenhagen. Copenhagen Airport was and still is Denmark's largest place of work. So that's why SAS in Denmark was very keen on keeping the 747 in the fleet already all the way up to the end. Actually, they didn't want the DC-10, because if you had the DC-10, you could operate direct services from Stockholm and from Oslo, Gothenburg, and so on, which was obviously not very good for the Danish. But the energy crisis in 1974 led to Boeing developing a combination aircraft, because the best SAS already in the late 60s, SAS would have wanted an aircraft combining passenger and cargo capacity. And that was Boeing's idea as well. So they launched an aircraft designed 747 Combi in 1976. SAS ordered 2 of these aircraft. And it combined the passenger capacity of a DC-863 with a cargo capacity of a DC-10. It was a perfect aircraft for SAS, and the aircraft they should have been operating from the beginning. The first aircraft was named Magnus Viking and delivered in 1977 in a small ceremony with SAS management from Seattle. And delivered, it became a great success. With the Combi aircraft, SAS could then introduce 747 services from Gothenburg, from Oslo, and from and increase their services from Copenhagen and also from Stockholm. But SAS did not make any money in those days. SAS made a lot of money, but not from tickets. They actually made money from selling or leasing aircraft to other airlines. And through the International Air Travel Association, as I mentioned, the airfares were set. You could not deviate from the ticket prices. That meant that in order to compete, the airlines would have to buy the most modern aircraft all the time, because if you had a modern aircraft, you can attract more passengers. They paid the same fare as any other airline, but if you had the newest 747, that meant you could probably attract some people more. And to be ordered to compete for the late 70s and 80s, SAS needed to become more efficient, and to become more efficient, every seat had to be cheaper, and for that to become true, you had to increase the capacity, and that's why the 747 Combi was such a great success. The 747 Combi was then able to be reconfigured depending on summer or winter services. So in the summer, there were 6 cargo pallets and 281 passengers. And in the winter, you converted it to 12 cargo pallets in the aft cabin and 209 passengers. And that flexibility made all the difference. It really was the perfect aircraft for SAS. But SAS had a new manager in those days, a new president, who was very economical, so to speak, and the service became poorer and poorer, much like in nowadays. Passengers paid a lot of money, but they didn't get the service they paid for, and it could be there were a lot of discounts. So if you were able to book your tickets very well in advance, you never paid the full fare. But as you were sat in the cabin, you could be sitting. You could have paid very little for your ticket to New York, and beside you there could be a businessman having purchased his ticket yesterday for 10 times more, and you would get the same service. The businessman obviously asked, "Why would I fly SAS if the person next to me paying nothing gets the same service?" SAS and several other airlines had this problem, and they launched what would become business class in the late 70s. SAS introduced this in 1979, and business class became a great success. Until then, there had only been first class and economy class on all the airlines, and business class was something that most airlines introduced in the late 70s and early 80s. With the Combi aircraft, SAS, as I said, would be able to operate from Norway and from Gothenburg as well. The Norwegian fish export was one of SAS main incomes, and they all the time up till the late 80s, SAS were the main transporters of Norwegian salmon to North America. And it could actually be that if you had an aircraft, the flight departing today, loaded with salmon, you can have those salmons in the fish shops around New York, being sold actually just a few hours after landing in New York. It was very, very fresh, and SAS made a lot of money. And SAS had a bit more offensive advertising in those days. On the right, you have a Norwegian advert saying they built a bridge over the Atlantic, showing first Leif Eriksson's Viking ship and the emigrants and Norwegian American line. And SAS then said, we fly it every day with 3,200 seats. The capacity was very large and very popular in those days. The old 747s, the two early 747s, were in the late 70s and early 80s quite old. They were beginning to get uneconomical. And in order to compete, you would have to change those two aircraft. And SAS ordered two new aircraft in 1979 to be delivered in 1980-81. And this is the 747 number 500 being rolled out in Seattle in 1980. It was named Viking. And the reason for buying these two new aircraft, number 5 and 6, was so that number 1 and 2, Hugo and Ivar from 1971, could be sold. And that was the strategy. If you would succeed with that, you would have 4 747s, and SAS would be well set for the 1980s. And to change the poor service and poor economy of SAS, they recruited a new manager, Jan Karlsson, who was a former travel guide from Vingresor, and then turned around the Swedish domestic airline Linjeflyg, which was almost bankrupt. He was then recruited to SAS and became president in 1981. And in 1981, the second energy crisis was in full swing. You had a revolution in Iran in 1979, which increased fuel prices 4 times. And those two early 747s, which SAS was planning to sell, were suddenly worthless. No one wanted those. So now SAS had 6 aircraft, 2 747s too many. It became a large problem. SAS lost a lot of money, was on the brink of bankruptcy. And SAS started leasing out aircraft or selling aircraft as much as possible. One solution was to sell the two new 747s to Norwegian bank, an American bank, and lease them back, which was a new concept in those days. Back then, SAS had also taken delivery of the first Airbus A300, which was to connect with the 747 cargo-wise. They were modified to take the same cargo containers as the 747, and they would operate SAS main lines from Scandinavia to Copenhagen, to London, Brussels, Paris, and so on. And the SAS cargo concept was that cargo customers all over Europe could transport their cargo on the A300, with a short connection in Copenhagen, and then be transported to North America in no time. So SAS purchased several modifications on their 4 Airbus A300s, which meant that they were impossible to get rid of now that the reality was completely different, because the A300 had no place in the new SAS fleet when the airline started focusing on businessmen instead of regular travelers. And there was a plan to sell the A300s. That was not possible due to some banks. So instead, they opted to get rid of the 747s. And one way to do that was to lease the aircraft to Nigeria Airways. SAS operated 747s for Nigeria Airways for 6 years, from 1982 to 1988. You had SAS flight crew with Nigerian cabin crew operating from between Lagos and London once every day, and later on in the 80s also between Lagos and New York. And that aircraft, that aircraft is Ivar Viking, the 747 number 2, which was operating for Nigeria Airways in the 1982 and 1983. And SAS also made an agreement with a Norwegian bank to sell those 2 earliest aircraft and lease them back, which made some money for SAS in those days when economy was very bad. Business class was improved to first business class, which became an immediate success in 1982. And SAS transformation from an old tied airline into the new modern businessman's airline of the 1980s was manifested by creating a new corporate identity. The old familiar Dragon Viking longboat was thrown out in 1983 and changed to these these stripes with the Scandinavian flags in 1983. And we're now in the mid-80s. The 747 was still great for the service to New York because it had its cargo capacity, which made the money for SAS, but it was very expensive to operate. And now the discussion came up whether to either purchase more 747s or dispose of the 747s and concentrate on a DC-10 fleet only. In 1984, it was decided to phase out the 747 over 3 years and concentrate on a single aircraft fleet of the DC-10 for the intercontinental services. But the DC-10 was to be a stopgap measure because that aircraft was becoming old as well. SAS was already looking at the future large aircraft. The purpose of concentrating on smaller aircraft such as the DC-10 was then, of course, that SAS would be able to operate more services from Stockholm, Gothenburg, Oslo, Stavanger, Bergen, and so on more frequently than a large single 747 each day from Copenhagen, which was in line with SAS strategy in the 1980s. But actually in 1984, SAS had 5 747s in their own service, which was quite amazing. So, I suppose you're familiar with the MD-11. Up to the left, there is an MD-11 in SAS colors, which is quite strange, but there is a reason. Already in 1986, SAS were looking at the replacement for the DC-10, and as a long-time McDonnell Douglas customer, everyone thought that SAS would obviously choose the MD-11, which was then on the drawing table. McDonnell Douglas was almost convinced that SAS would choose the MD-11, so they made an offer. McDonnell Douglas offered to take on 2 of SAS 747s if SAS placed 12 options for the new MD-11, which sounded quite good. It sounded so good that the press department in SAS issued a press release saying that SAS had ordered 12 MD-11s in 1986, which wasn't exactly true because they had only SAS had actually only purchased delivery positions and nothing else, not even options. Boeing and Airbus were quite upset, understandably, about this, as they had not been approached at all. Boeing had the 767 going on, and Airbus were in the construction phase of what would become the Airbus A340. McDonnell Douglas were very happy about this and claimed that the SAS decision was fundamental in their decision to launch the MD-11 project. And furthermore, Finnair ordered the MD-11, and according to the sources I have seen, Finnair was influenced by the SAS decision for the MD-11. They envisioned technical cooperation and some other maybe joint training as well. But it was all not true. SAS hadn't ordered the MD-11. They didn't even have options. This was all because of a poorly translated press information message. So it was it was a scandal, and some people in the SAS head office, I think, were replaced actually. Eventually, Finnair received their first MD-11, and they were first in the world to operate the MD-11 in 1990, as you all know, obviously. As I said earlier, SAS and Finnair cooperation had been a bit bad since the late 1960s, but in the late 80s, SAS approached Finnair again for a cooperation agreement. In 1990, SAS, Swissair, and Austrian Airlines formed the European Quality Alliance together with Finnair, and that was the first commercial airline alliance, actually. Finnair left that partnership quite early because Finnair, it soon became clear for Finnair that they would become connecting carrier to SAS, so to speak. They envisioned that they would be playing second line to SAS, and they didn't want that, so they left the alliance and eventually started cooperating with Lufthansa in 1995 and Transwede as well. When SAS approached Lufthansa 1 year later, Finnair was understandably very upset, but eventually became part of One World with British Airways and Japan Airlines and so on, which they still are today. And SAS, together with Lufthansa and the other airlines, formed Star Alliance in 1997. And from the European Quality Alliance became nothing. KLM eventually joined, and the plan was to merge these 4 airlines in a project called Alcazar. The airline would have been called Symphony, which would become one single airline in the 1990s. But that project collapsed when no one could, well, each airline wanted their own American partner airline, and they couldn't decide where the main head office should be placed. And KLM left, and the whole Symphony project collapsed. And a few years later, Star Alliance became reality for SAS and Lufthansa, and the other airlines formed their own alliances. Well, in 1987, the SAS operated their last 747 flights in May 1987. Back then, the second aircraft, Ivar Viking, had already been sold. It went to British Airways, actually, and a few years later, it went on to Virgin Atlantic Airways, who operated the aircraft until 1999. The aircraft on the upper left is Hugh Viking. That aircraft was sold to Minerve, a French charter airline, in 1987, who operated it until 1992 mainly on charter services to the French Caribbean. It then was left standing in Paris for over a year until an American demolition firm bought it, flew it over to Arizona, and scrapped it. And this is the last known picture of the former Hugh Viking, taken in 1994. It was only 23 years old, young, rather. That aircraft is the Dan Viking, the 500th aircraft shown, which I showed you earlier. It went on to be converted to a freighter for flying for UPS, and it flew until 2011. It's now scrapped. That one on the lower right is one of the SAS combis. That is the former Knut Viking, delivered in 1979. And it has been grounded in France since 2007, where it still stands on a small airport in Châteauroux in France. And it's actually the only 747 still in existence, but it's abandoned and in very poor condition. The last SAS passenger service was operated in August of 1987, and actually 3 of the former SAS aircraft went on to serve with Philippine Airlines for a few years. As I said in the beginning, SAS, or rather Scanair, the charter sister airline of SAS, operated the 747s on the weekends. And this is Ivar Viking in Las Palmas in the early 1970s, and you can feel the hot, warm Atlantic air and the kerosene smell. It's wonderful. In 1982-1983, Scanair was able to operate with 747 full-time for a year, and also they did it for a few weeks in 1987. But the people I've spoken to who worked with Scanair on the 747 said that actually they loved it. It was the best aircraft they ever had, and the passengers as well. Flying on holiday in a giant jumbo liner couldn't have been a better start or ending on the vacation. After the DC-10, SAS operated the DC-10 then until 1991. They eventually chose the Boeing 767 to replace the DC-10. DC-10, the 767 was operated until 2003. When they had replaced it with the Airbus 330 and 340. The 330 is still in service with SAS, and since 2019, the Airbus 350 is SAS' main long-range aircraft. And the Airbus 350 is actually the largest aircraft SAS has operated since the 747. And the first aircraft was delivered to SAS in 2019, and everything looked very nice and very good. Passengers were coming back to SAS after a few difficult years. And then the COVID-19 virus struck the entire airline industry, and SAS went down again, as did everyone else. As I said in the beginning, in 1996, the 747 made a comeback in SAS. This was SAS Cargo then, who leased, originally they leased a DC-8 freighter. In the mid-1990s, the Swedish export was running at an all-time high. Volvo, Saab, SKF, and Ericsson exported enormous amounts of electronics and cars to all over the world. And Gothenburg, situated in central Scandinavia, was a natural hub for the cargo flights. So SAS began in 1995 by leasing a DC-8 63 freighter, but that became too small very quickly. So they went up a step and leased the 747 through Atlas Air. The first aircraft was actually painted in SAS livery and arrived in Gothenburg in March of 1996. And it had 110 tons of cargo capacity, operating from Gothenburg to New York and Gothenburg, Macau, Osaka all the time. And the pilot group they were operating as a small airline in itself because they were flying on American licenses. So SAS had little to do with this operation. They were actually caring about themselves. And if they had a maintenance problem or even some part that needed to be replaced in New Delhi or something, the pilots took up the mobile phone, called to, I have one instance, for example, they had a damaged slat on the ground in New Delhi. They called actually Cathay Pacific in Hong Kong, asked, do you have a slat for the 747 we can borrow? Yes, we have, they said. 3 hours later, the slat had arrived in New Delhi, and Air India technicians were able to mount it on the aircraft. Another nice story is in Gothenburg when they were to transport a load of horses back to New York, and the horses' vaccination certificates were running out in a few hours. The aircraft was standing on the ground with a technical malfunction. If the horses didn't arrive back in the United States on time, they would not be able to compete in the next competition because their vaccination certificates would be invalid. So the first thing they did was to load the horses on the aircraft because the aircraft were registered in America, so it was officially American territory. And then one of the pilots who would be operating that flight, he called Lufthansa Cargo and asked, hey, I'm from SAS Cargo. We're stuck with a 747 on the ground in Gothenburg. Do you possibly have a 747 freighter available for flying Gothenburg to New York right now? Yes, we have. 3 hours later, or maybe 2 hours later, a 747 freighter from Lufthansa arrived in Gothenburg. They moved their horses over to that one. It went away to New York, and the situation was solved. And then the bill was sent to SAS head office, who came back and asked, what the hell did you do? Well, we solved the situation. They said, well, you can't do that, but well done anyway. So it was an airline with an airline, and it went very good. They had a great time, and the gentleman in the white smoking on the left is Mr. Jan Nordin. He was the chief pilot for this operation between 1996 and 1999. And that photo is taken somewhere over the North Atlantic, going home from New York to Gothenburg on the very last flight in the Easter weekend of 1999. And he was the final and last 747 pilot in SAS. And to celebrate that, the entire flight crew were dressed in smoking. And that was the end of the 747 era in SAS. And that is the end of my speech as well, my speech. And this is my book. It's in Swedish. It's published by Trafiknostalgiska förlaget in Stockholm. It's available it's available here, and it's available from the Finnish Adlibris net bookshop if you want it there. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I was good enough in English. Thank you. Well, actually, the next book is about Scandinavian, the charter airline. And I have some ideas because the entire Nordic charter scene is very interesting. So I would actually like to write a book about all the charter airlines in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. But I think that project will be too huge. So I will, I think, concentrate on a book about Scandinavian because that story has never been told as well. So, but I have a lot of ideas, so you never know.
About the Finnish MD-11 and the crisis with the SAS MD-11. Is that public knowledge, or have you?
It's not public knowledge. It's known by within historical, between some historians we know about it, but it was actually told in SAS staff magazine and in some book, I think, back in those days, but it's been forgotten since. And SAS involvement in McDonnell Douglas, it was the same in the 1990s when SAS wanted to replace their DC-9 fleet, and everyone thought that SAS would opt for the MD-95. McDonnell Douglas counted on SAS ordering the MD-95 to replace the DC-9 because they had the MD-80, they had the MD-90. And then they went for the Boeing 737, 600, 700, and 800. And that was, some say that was the last nail in the McDonnell Douglas coffin. And that was when Boeing then purchased McDonnell Douglas. So SAS had been very involved with Douglas since the 1930s, but they haven't been very kind with them at the same time. If it's true, I'm not an expert on McDonnell Douglas, but I've heard that story being told by many. So SAS turned Douglas down with two separate occasions within 10 years. I see. I love the MD-11. Actually, as I said, I was working with SAS Flight Academy, and almost 20 years ago now, we were at Finnair Flight Academy on a conference, and I was able to fly the MD-11 simulator. I asked specifically for it, and I loved every single second of it. It's a wonderful aircraft.
It was never flying this size.
No, it's Singapore Airlines, Pan American, and some various airlines. It ended up with Transjet, a Swedish charter airline, which went bankrupt. So never said, no, not SAS, no. Can you repeat the question? I didn't hear you from the beginning. Yeah.
SAS, they had quite a lot of
relationship
Yes.
with the pilots and flying. Did they fly any 747 like interconnected so that?
No, there wasn't any cooperation in the 747 between Thai and SAS. Strangely enough, SAS owned 30% of Thai until 1977, and after that there was only a commercial cooperation, a bit small technical cooperation, but mainly commercial. But there was never 747 cooperation. Strangely enough, between SAS and Thai, only DC-8 Caravelle, DC-9. Oh yes. Oh yes, they had. Yeah. And some of the SAS 747 pilots in the 1980s, when they were reducing the fleet, they went to Thai, but then they were employed by Thai, and they went to EVA Airways in Taiwan and some other Asian airlines. So a lot of SAS 747 and DC-10 pilots went to Asian airlines, but they were employed by them. Yeah. In 1946.
DC-10 the last to have it?
Because
I have a metal model of DC-10 and it has.
Yeah, it was replaced. It was in 1983. The new livery was introduced with the flag stripes. So until 1983, the dragon emblem was used. So the DC-10 had it, yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And there is no
questions in.
site and you need to be.
Nothing questions in chat.
Ei ollut mitään. As a memory of this, I will give you. This is
very good.
so
I
you
need
can
that.
see yourself by the drivers.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hyvä. Tämä ei ole muutama kuukauden ja vähän kahvia vielä jälleen satsaamatta tai kahvia saamatta, niin kirjoja ja lisää tapahtumia sitten joulukuulla ensi vuoden. Kiitoksia päättelystä.